Hello, my wonderful students, Dell here. As promised, here is a video showing the basic photo editing techniques that we went over in class the other day. I'm going to show you how to edit a photo of a sculpture in GIMP. GIMP is a free photo editor that you can get from gimp.org, but you're also welcome to use any other photo editor that has the features that you need. Basically something that can crop, something that can exposure and color balance, something that can get rid of distracting spots, and something that can export your file in the desired format. For you all, it'll be JPEG because that's what you're going to upload to BBLearn. So on my screen you see the GIMP window. It is quite a powerful program, especially considering it is free. The one disadvantage perhaps is that its interface isn't quite as cleanly designed as something like Photoshop, but it will definitely work for the purposes of this class. Some areas to be aware of: at the top of the screen you have your program menu. This is where all your big commands live, things like opening and saving and making overall edits to your file. You'll find them under the menu items at the top here in this program menu. At the left-hand side on the upper corner, there is this tool palette right here. All of these are different tools and things that you can do to change up the image that will eventually be in the palette in the center of the screen here. Each one has tool-specific commands that appear in this menu at the lower left. So for example, if I choose different tools, you can see that the tool-specific palette at the bottom changes according to whatever it is you need for that tool. So a very powerful combination over here. On the other side of the window, you see a brush palette here. We won't really be messing with that too much today, but there's another area that is important over here on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's at the lower right here. This is the levels palette, and this is going to be important for reasons you'll see in a moment. So that's a basic layout here in GIMP. To get started, you're going to want to open a file that you can work on. So if you've taken photos on your phone and you're working on your computer, you can text or email to yourself, or use a USB connector to transfer those photos over so that you can work on them. I'm going to go ahead and open a photo that I already have on the desktop, and so to do that I go up to the Program menu and I select File and I look for Open. When I click open, it'll pull up a gray dialog box. This is what you probably couldn't see in class the other day. And it is not a super pretty dialog. This is what I mean about GIMP not being quite as cleanly designed as Photoshop, but it's functional. So it shows me places on my computer. It also shows me the name of things in various places. Right now it's got me on a recently used folder, and you'll see the images that I was working with in class the other day. But I can go to other places as well. So I'm actually going to go here to the desktop, and I'm going to go through here and look for the Raven image, which you saw in class the other day, and then I'm going to go down here and I'm going to click Open in the lower right. As I said in class, GIMP does one thing that's really nice. It offers you the opportunity to rotate your image if it was upside down or sideways in your camera. And apparently I took my Raven photo upside down, so GIMP is saying, hey, do you want me to rotate this for you automatically? And that's a super nice offer. So I'm going to let it do that. I'm going to click the thing that says rotate down here, and then you'll see the Raven flips right side up and makes it a little bit easier. It saves me a step, basically. When you open something in GIMP, you will get a new layer that appears over here on that lower right corner in the layers palette. You can see it says Raven JPEG. This is just the photograph as it comes out of your camera. And one of the things that's really great about programs like GIMP and Photoshop is they rely on these layers in order to be non-destructive. And what I mean by that is that you never have to alter this original layer unless for some reason you want to. And that's important because sometimes we make changes and they don't end up being so great. So we want to always be able to get back to our original. You can see that there's a little eyeball icon to the left of this raven.jpg layer. This just controls whether we can see the layer at any given time, and that'll become important for something that we do moving forward. But for right now, just be aware that it is there. So everything that I do today, actually, I am not going to do on my original layer. I'm going to create another layer on which I can make changes. You can actually make lots and lots of layers, and many people do, but for this simple kind of photo editing we're doing here, one will suffice. To get a duplicate of this layer that I can work on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this is selected. You can see it's selected because it's darker than the background around it. And then I'm going to go up to the program menu at the top and find the menu item that says layer. I'll click on it and then I will go down to where it says duplicate layer, select that, and then if I go back over here to the layers menu, you'll see that there's a new layer that's appeared above our original layer that says raven.jpg copy. The way layers work is that whatever is on top in the layers palette window is going to be the thing that is most visible. If I click the eyeball off, you won't see any difference right now because this is an exact copy of the Raven JPEG that we started with, but eventually this is going to change and it's going to become really handy for us to compare. One thing that I think is very helpful to do and that you should try to get in the habit of doing is you should rename layers that you're working with something descriptive to make it easier to find them in the future. So I'm just going to label this working layer. That way I can keep track of what's my original and what I'm working on. This is especially important if you ever get into very detailed photo editing or digital painting or something like that, where you might have dozens or even hundreds of layers. You can quickly get lost if you don't name them and organize them. All right, so now that I've got my duplicate layer that I can work on, I'm going to start to make some edits on this photo. We're going to start with cropping. So to crop, I need to find the crop tool over here in my tool palette. One thing that GIMP doesn't do super well is somebody came up with these icons to try to suggest what's what, but they're not necessarily all super clear. Like this one I always look at, what the heck is that supposed to be? It looks like an upside down truck or something like that. But you can see what happened when I held my cursor there for a little bit longer. A tooltip will appear that tells you exactly what any given tool is. So if you're lost and you're like, where is the crop tool? Just kind of hover over until you find the one that says crop tool. The crop tool in GIMP does look like it looks in pretty much every photo editing program, two sort of intersecting L-like shapes. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and select that crop tool, and when I do that, I will get a new cursor that I can move over my photograph. It looks like crosshairs with a little knife in there, and I can use this to crop down my photo however big I want it to be. When we were talking the other day about photographing your artwork, I mentioned that you want to make sure you had white space all the way around your sculpture, but that doesn't mean you might not have a little bit of background that crept in on one side just because of the way we're photographing these. But fortunately, it's easy to get rid of that. With the crop tool activated, I put the crosshairs where I want the first corner to be. I click my mouse down and you'll see it changes to kind of a box like this. And then I will pull and drag with the cursor held down until I get a box that encompasses only the things that I want. So I'm going to trim a little off the bottom, a little off the top and left side, and quite a lot off the right side here. When I let go of my mouse button or my trackpad button, I end up having a lit box in the center that shows what I've selected, and then this kind of grayed out box on the side that shows what will be cropped off. If you didn't quite get it right the first time, you can adjust your crop box. You just move your cursor until you get this little orange box on the side and a cursor that looks like a kind of a triangle with two dashes next to it. That will allow me to grab the edge of this and move it. And you can do that at the corners and the top or bottom too, but just fine tune it until you get what looks good to you compositionally. We want to be able to see your entire sculpture. We don't want anything cut off, but we don't want a ton of white space around that. So keep that in mind. Once you've got it where you want, you're just going to hit the return key and booyah, it has been cropped for you. Now sometimes, especially after you crop, this feels a little bit small to me in the screen, like I can't quite see what's going on. So I can actually change the view of my sculpture. If I go up here to the view menu and I go down to zoom, I want to make this as big as I can, so I can choose this thing that says fit image in window, and it will blow the sculpture up for me. There's also a little menu item down here at the bottom that just shows different kinds of zooms. So I can make it smaller again or, blow it up however I want using that little tooltip trick. All right, so we've got this in the window. It looks cropped well, looks pretty good. I've already checked the sharpness in my camera, but it's not a bad idea to make sure everything is in focus in the program too before you go too much further, because as you may remember, focus is the one thing we can't really correct too much in a photo editing program. It never looks that great when we try to sharpen things. So the next thing I think I might try to do is correct the exposure and the color balance a little bit. This isn't too bad. It actually doesn't look terrible, but because I was using a yellowish light bulb, the background looks a little bit yellow, and it's also just a little bit dark. You know, the sculpture itself looks pretty good, but this background was white paper and it looks a little bit yellow and dulled out. So I'm going to see if I can correct those things. I'm going to make sure again that my working layer is selected, and then all of the adjustments for things like color and exposure live up at the top under this menu item called colors. If I pull that down, you can see there's color balance, temperature, hue, exposure, all kinds of things. Play around with those, see what each one does. But the one I use the most is this one right here, levels. So if I click on that, you'll see it opens another pop-up menu here with a whole lot of information in it. It has got this little chart here. What this shows is basically where the distribution of your lights, middle tones, and darks are. It also has some sliders underneath here. What these do is they adjust the light point, the midpoint, and the dark point. So for example, if I grab this little white triangle and click and drag it over, you'll see that all of the whites in the image get lighter. If I do the same thing with the dark slider, you'll see that the darks get much darker. And then the mid-tone slider, you can actually either move that to make the midtones darker, or you can move it to make the midtones lighter. It's a very powerful tool, the levels palette. You can do similar things by clicking on exposure or brightness and contrast, but I think levels allows you to fine-tune things a lot more. The other thing that the levels palette can do that is really cool is down here at the lower right, there are these three little eyedropper icons. One has a dark square, one has a mid-tone square, and one has a light square. And you'll see if I hover it over it, it says, you know, pick gray point for all channels, pick black point for all channels, etc. The one I find most useful for art photography is this white one here. So if I click this so it's selected, and then I move my cursor over my photograph, you'll see that the cursor is changed to a crosshairs with a little dropper next to it. What it's wanting me to do is select a point that I think should be white on this. So for example, this little area in here that looks kind of yellowy, I know that that's supposed to be white paper. So if I click here, it will change the entire photograph to match this being white. And it not only changes the exposure of things, but it also changes the color balance to some extent. So a lot of times you can more or less fix your entire photograph by just sort of noodling around here and finding a white point that kind of matches what it is that you think you need your sculpture to look like. So that did a lot for us. I can tweak things a little bit. I might pull this white up just a little bit more. Maybe I'll add back in just a little dark so it doesn't feel washed out. But that looks pretty good. And once I get it where I want it to be, I'm just going to click OK. And now I have a photo that looks so much whiter and cleaner than it did before. I can see this because if I go over to the layers palette and I click the eyeball and hide it, here's the original, here's the color corrected one. You want to make sure that you have everything from white whites all the way to dark darks in your photograph. That's how you know you've done a pretty good job. Another thing that you can do from the colors up here is you can adjust the color balance. So this doesn't look too bad at all after we did our levels, but it does have a few spots that look a little bit yellow in the highlights and maybe a little bit blue in the shadows. So if I want to neutralize that a little bit or make it a little bit less color saturated, I can choose this color balance and it will pull up another pop-up menu here. This has a couple of adjustments that are good to know. The first one is this thing that says select range to adjust. So you can select the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. So for example, if I feel my shadows are too blue, I might select that shadows there and then come down to the adjust color levels, which has got another set of sliders. All three of them are dual color schemes. So we've got cyan versus red, magenta versus green, yellow versus blue. So if I want those shadows to be a little less blue, maybe I'll turn down, by clicking and dragging, turn down this blue coloration a little bit in the shadows, Might be a little too much. Right about there looks good. I'm also going to go up to the shadows, I think, and see if I can take a little bit of the sort of yellow coloration out of there. Not too much. I don't want it to look real purpley. And then also just tweak some of these other sliders a little bit so it looks a little more neutral. Okay, that looks pretty good to me, so I'm going to click OK. And again, I can compare my corrected versus my original. Sometimes you have spots in your image that are just a little bit too dark, like right in here behind the beak, this background is just a little bit too dark. One thing that can help there, and this is by no means absolutely necessary for these particular photographs, but if there's something that's bugging you a little bit, this tool here that looks like an upside down lollipop, it's a dodge burn tool. And if I select this, you see the tool palette comes up and it offers you a whole bunch of options like how opaque you want this to be, how big you want your brush to be, how strong you want it to be, the force. So right now you can see I have a relatively little brush over here. I'm going to make that brush a little bit bigger by just typing in the number that I want. So I'm going to go to 300 and then click return. Then I'm just going to brush it a little bit over where this background is and just lighten up that area so I don't feel like I have a shadow behind this bird's beak. If I did it a whole lot, if I just come in here and keep going, you can see that kind of lighter streak that forms there. That's what's happening. With the dodge tool, it's definitely better to do this a little bit at a time rather than going too far. And if you do too much, like I did right here, I think you all probably remember the command I gave you to undo. It's Command Z on a Mac or Control Z on a PC. It's the best command ever, so I'm just going to Command Z on my Mac here and get rid of that little mistake I made. So just clean this up a little bit more. And that is looking really nice and even in the background. And again, we can compare what a difference just those simple adjustments have made. Okay, so the last thing you may want to do in terms of editing this is to get rid of any distracting marks. This may be something that you don't need to do if you had a clean backdrop and there weren't any wrinkles or gaps like there are in my paper backdrop right here, but for some people that's not going to be the case. So I'm going to show you one simple way to get rid of these kinds of distracting marks within your image. There are actually a number of ways you can do this, but I'm going to use the clone tool because I think it's one of the most easy for people to understand, especially if you don't have photo editing experience. So the clone tool in the tools palette looks like our little rubber stamp right here, and if I select this, you'll see the tool palette changes to the whole bunch of different options. Really the only one we care about is the size of the brush, which you can tell because if I mouse over the image, you see a little circle there that shows how big a brush we're going to be using, and the hardness of the brush. So the hardness just refers to whether it's got feathery edges. What I'm going to recommend is that you set this hardness somewhere around 60%, 70% in there. That's going to give you enough of a clean clone to cover up what you need to cover up, but it'll still be a little fuzzed at the edges so it blends in. So to use the clone tool, you're going to need to sample a source. This works basically by copying the pixels in one area of your image and then just importing them into another area of your image. To actually clone, I will put the cursor of the clone tool in an area that's very similar to what I want to cover. So for example, for this fold, this section right next to it that shares the same kind of shadow and light. I will then click either the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC. With that held down, I will click my mouse to select the area, and then you see it leaves behind a little circle that shows where the source is, and then I move my cursor to where I want to apply those pixels, click the mouse or the trackpad again, and voila, it's covered up. You can continually click new source areas with Command and a mouse click to find different areas to cover up. You can also just hold the mouse and move it around as I'm doing here if you have a big section that's all kind of similar, and that will conceal things very nicely. So that looks a lot better already. I've gotten out most of those little lines. I could keep going and tweaking if I wanted to, but just to compare, here's the original with all those take marks and lines clearly visible. And if I turn this layer back on, it looks much, much better. So we're going to call it at this point. It looks pretty good. I think I'm ready to save my image. And it is actually not super intuitive how you save files in GIMP. So like most programs, if you go to the File menu and pull it down, there's actually a whole bunch of different ways to save this file. So for example, if I click Save, it'll open up this dialog box, and you'll see at the top it says Name, and you'll be given the option to change that name. It has places here on the left telling you where you can potentially save it to. It also, down here at the bottom, has a bunch of text grouped together that you hardly even notice, including this thing that says select file type by extension. So if we want to change this up here, this 3-letter file type, we can do that here. By default, GIMP saves as a .xcf file, which is its native file format, and it's actually a nice file format. It's kind of equivalent to a Photoshop document or a TIFF. It will save a file that has all its layers intact, so you can go back in later on and work on it. I would highly recommend saving an XCF file if you have room for it on your hard drive, because again, you can go back and edit it. But the problem is it's not a file format that we can put on, say, BBLearn. So we need to find a different way to save things for BBLearn. And if I open this file type by extension down here, you see that there actually isn't any option for JPEG or even PNG or GIF down in here. It's all of these weird things that don't seem to relate to anything. So that's not going to help us very much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel that out, and I'm going to go back up to the File menu, and where you'll actually go to save the file that goes on BBLearn is right here, Export As. So if I click that, you'll see it pulls up a very similar dialog box, name at the top, places to save it here, and then more text down here. First thing I'm going to do is rename my file. For your project, I'm going to ask you to name it with your last name, the title of the project, so in this case we'll just call it Project 1, and then you can say Photo 1 or Photo 2 because you'll have 2 photos that you're uploading. And then I'll choose my place. I'm just going to save it to the desktop. Then I'm going to go down here to the bottom, and I'm going to click again that thing that says Select File Type by Extension. Open this up, and now you see there are a lot more file types down here, things that I have never heard of. What the heck is a ZSoft PCX image? I don't know that I want to know. But at any rate, if I scroll up here, we see our friendly neighborhood JPEG image right here. So I'm going to make sure I select that, and then I'm going to click Export. When I do that, I'll get another dialog box here that asks me questions about what kind of JPEG. I'm just going to turn the quality all the way up, and then all of these other things right now, I don't need to worry about those. You can just leave those as is unless you want to fool with them yourself for some reason. And then I'll just click Export. Okay, and now if I were to go to open, I see that here on my desktop is Zartner Project 1 Photo 1, and I can even open that up. And you'll see my 2 open files here. Here's the one that I just saved. You can see it named over here in the palette. And here is the one that I edited with the layers in there, where you can see the difference between the 2 layers. So that's it. That is basic photo editing for your sculptures in GIMP. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me. You can also certainly ask Google. It's very knowledgeable about how to edit things through photo editing programs. That's it. Happy photographing and happy photo editing, and I will see you in class soon.